Good morning, everyone. This is Asara Clark with ONC. Just going to give a couple minutes for folks to get joined and connected to audio here. We'll get started around 2 after. Welcome to today's real-world testing webinar, and we'll get started very shortly. No, not you. We are just giving folks another minute or so just to get joined. Welcome to today's real-world testing webinar. And we're going to go ahead and get started as it's 2 after. So good. Let me go ahead and pin myself here. All right. Can you guys hear me good? Can I get a thumbs up from someone, please? Okay, great. Thank you, thank you. All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Asara Clark. I am with ONC, the Division of Certification and Testing, Certification and Testing Senior Advisor, and I am also lead on real-world testing. And I'll be doing the real-world testing webinar presentation today. Just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. We're going to be going through real-world testing requirements. As if you may or may not be aware that we did some webinars earlier in the year where we sort of went over at a high level what real-world testing means for health IT developers. Today, we're going to go a little bit deeper into development of the plan, just to make sure that you truly understand what needs to go into your real-world testing plan, you know, making sure that you have a complete plan when submitted to your ACB by the deadline they've identified and for submission, and making sure that you just have all your questions answered. So this particular webinar today, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the plan development, and we'll go from there. So just allow me a second to, well, before I share my screen, just want to just let you guys know up front that the slides from today's webinar, as well as the recording, will be made publicly available on our real world testing webpage on healthit.gov. We may or may not have time at the end of today's webinar to take some questions. Just depends upon how long how close we are to the hour when we finish up the presentation. Larger questions should be submitted to your ONC ACB, but you can feel free to insert questions into the chat. And if we have time at the end of today's webinar, we will go ahead and take a few questions. So give me 1 second. I want to share my screen, get this presentation up, and we'll get started. All right. All right, perfect. So just for, you know, as a standard, we like to always go over the disclaimer where, you know, what we present today is to provide clarifications, give a better understanding of what has been adopted in regulation, but the regulation is the authoritative document that you need to reference for all certification program requirements. So it supersedes this slide deck, and you should know that. So we want to make sure that we always go over that before we get into the information. Now, before we get into the plan, we're just going to go over some very high-level background information on what real-world testing is, just to make sure that we're all having, we're on an even playing field with understanding what we're presenting today in today's discussion. So what is real-world testing? Real-world testing is a process by which health IT developers are going to demonstrate interoperability and functionality of their certified health IT in the settings and scenarios in which they're deployed. Health IT developers achieve certification by being tested in a controlled testing environment by ONC authorized certification bodies. And so we want to know how these work when they're in the field, in the wild, in a production environment, when they're being used. Real-world testing is a process by which health IT developers can demonstrate that the functionalities that they've been certified to still remain once they've been deployed in the field and are being used. Real-world testing is intended to be conducted and to measure for the developer to measure observation, in measuring observations of the functionality. So there are going to be a lot of things that I'm going to talk about today for how the developer has full flexibility to determine how they want to measure, what metrics and measurements they're going to use as they do these observations in the field, and how they can plan for these and include these in their real-world testing plans. So just as a quick note, successful real-world testing, we have outlined it in the preamble of our regulation. We had some discussion about it and what it means. And so we have this here as well for your reference, where certified health IT is considered to be successfully real-world tested when it continues to be compliant with the certification criteria, including the required technical standards and vocabulary code sets. Certified health IT is exchanging electronic health information in the care and practice settings for which it is marketed for use. And electronic health information is received by and used in certified health IT. Now, who is required to conduct real-world testing? Health IT developers that have health IT certified for any of the applicable real-world testing criteria. The certification criteria that applies to real-world testing, I'll go over in just a moment. But as a condition of certification, health IT developers must successfully real-world test their technology that's been certified to interoperability and exchange certification criteria. And again, those certification criteria, I'll go over in just a second, but they are outlined in section 170.405A of the Cures Act final rule. Now, as a maintenance of certification requirement, health IT developers must submit a real-world testing plan to their ONC ACB by the date the ONC ACB informs you it must be submitted. So the ACBs have their own deadline. I'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation as well. But they have to make sure that your real-world testing plan, the health IT developer's real-world testing plan, is made publicly available on Chapel no later than December 15th of each calendar year. As another maintenance of certification requirement, health IT developers must also report on their real-world testing activities. They have to plan it out, what they're going to do, they have to do it, and then you have to report on it. And those reports must be made available on Chapel by March 15th of each calendar year. And so your ONC ACB will also have a date for real-world testing reports. They'll also have a submission date for a deadline by which you need to submit those reports to them. Now, you notify the responsible ONC ACB of any nonconformities with certification program requirements, should any come up during your real-world testing. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation as well. So as a condition of certification, you have to real-world test. If you have within the scope of your certification any of the applicable real-world testing certification criteria, and as maintenance of certification requirements, you have to do this planning, submit the plan to your ACB. It must be made publicly available, and then you have to report on your real-world testing activities and report to your ONC ACB any nonconformities during real-world testing. So as promised, here are the applicable real-world testing certification criteria. Not going to go through every one of them, but you should know that these are all of the interoperability and data exchange criteria that we have adopted. They are care coordination, patient engagement, clinical quality measures, electronic exchange, application programming interfaces, and public health criteria. So this will be, again, within this deck for your reference. Now let's talk about what health IT modules you need to include in your real-world testing plan, all right? And when those certifications to the applicable certification criteria must have been achieved for it to go into the next year's plan. All right, so real-world testing plans are intended to describe your approaches for the following year of real-world testing. Okay, so the year that you submit your plan is going to address the following year, the following calendar year in which you'll perform your real world testing activities, okay? Now, all health IT modules that have been certified as of August 31st of the year you're submitting your plan must be included in that plan that addresses your activities for the next year of real world testing. All right, this process is required on an ongoing yearly basis, okay? So this is a rolling cycle. So this here just explains the timeline. Again, some of you may already be very familiar with this, but we want to make sure that everyone has the same information. So if you take a look at the timeline, let's just take this year, 2021, where we are, and we recently had the deadline approach for the deadline for certifications to have been achieved for real world testing that is going to occur in the year of 2022, next year. All right, so all of your certified health IT that has the applicable real world testing certification criteria included within its scope, as of August 31st of last month, 2021, which was last month, should be included in your plan that you're going to submit to your ONC ACB. Now we're within this kind of design and submit a real world testing plan phase that you see here above the gray bar. So what should be happening right now, right, is you should be developing your plan. If you haven't already done so, you should be working with your ACB. You should know what their deadline is, so that you can submit your real world testing plan so that by December 15th of this year, your real world testing plan will be made publicly available on Chapel. Now, when we get into 2022, everything you put in that plan that you submit to your ACB, you're going to go out and actually implement it, all right? And you're going to be conducting real world testing throughout the year of 2022. I'm going to talk about how these activities overlap in just a second, because you'll see that as you're conducting real world testing, you're going to also be working on another plan in the latter part of next year of 2022. But once you complete 2022 real world testing, those results are going to be due to your ONC ACB to be made publicly available on Chapel by March 15th of the following year, which will be 2023. Okay, so this is the deal. You have to just make sure you are communicating with your ACB, that you know their deadlines so that they can meet their deadlines, because they are required to make sure that all health IT developers they work with and have issued certifications for their health IT, that they are making sure that their real world testing plans and results are accounted for. All right. Now that life cycle that I just talked about, I'm not going to spend too much time on this scenario. I went over this on our last webinar, so you could pull up the actual recording on those if you want to hear me walk through it. But just note that, as I mentioned, there is a lot of overlap, okay, in conducting the planning, conducting, and reporting for real world testing. So again, as I mentioned, when you're in the example for this year, when you're conducting that 2022 real world testing, you're going to have the August 31st, 2022 deadline approach, where all certifications that have been issued as of August 31st, 2022 need to be included in a plan that you're going to develop for your 2023 real world testing. So you'll be wrapping up your 2022 plan, right? And then you'll also be planning for the following year. So there's a lot of overlap with the real world testing, planning, conducting, and reporting requirements that ONC has put out for these conditions and maintenance of certification. And so you just want to make sure that you are staying up to speed with your ONC ACB, and that you're planning appropriately and accordingly for any certifications that you have as of August 31st of each and every year, okay? Now, we have received a real world testing plan FAQ that we definitely, want to make sure that we cover. We've gotten this FAQ from developers as well as ONC ACBs, where, folks want to know, can I submit a testing plan for the following calendar year for a health IT module or certification criteria certified after the August 31st deadline that I keep referring to? Okay, so the answer to this is, at a minimum, developers must include in their real world testing plan for the following year all health IT certified as of August 31st. We know that, we've just stressed that. But you also may include in your real world testing plan health IT modules and that have been updated after August 31st. It is not prohibited. you can do that, okay? It's important to know that even though you add them in, and it's not required, that you still need to think about the year coming when those updates will be subject to real world testing. Those updates will be applicable to the following year, but you can certainly real world test them and incorporate them into your approaches and go out and demonstrate functionality and conformance to them in the following year if you so choose. Developers that do choose to make these updates should understand that, that do choose to include these updates should understand that every year that your certification is valid and still active, you still have to include them in your plan. So you don't get it when you real world test. It doesn't mean that you don't have to continue to do it year after year after year. So long as those certifications remain active and valid, you have to real world test every single year, okay? As long as they're active certifications. With the inherited certified status updates that are made via inherited certified status flexibility, just know that if you seek inherited certified status from your ONC ACB after the August 31st deadline, you're still going to be held accountable and subject to real world testing, because the parent listing is the date that will be attached to that certification. So if your ACB tells you after you've made a patch update or rolled out some kind of update after the August 31st deadline, using the inherited certified status flexibility, you're still going to be held accountable for real world testing for the following year. You may hear this from your ONC ACB. So wanted to make sure that you understand that this is how ONC is handling inherited certified status updates after August 31st. All right. So that was like the background information. I'm sure you all probably knew most of that information. That's why I didn't want to spend too much time on it. But now we're going to get into designing and submitting your real world testing plan. Okay. Just so that you know, we have made public a real world testing optional template. All right, this is something that ONC put together to assist health IT developers in organizing all this information that has to go into your plan. There's a lot of information that you have to insert in there. And so we just thought that giving you an optional template to organize and, know how to structure your plan would be helpful. So within this template, you're going to have fields where you can fill out and insert responses to and everything. But like I said, basically, it's just really, really intended to help you organize it into the document that you will submit to your ONC ACB. And it's important to note that ONC ACBs may also have additional requirements. So you just want to confirm, work with your ACB really closely, make sure that you have a clear understanding of their submission requirements, deadlines, and everything, and on top of what we're presenting here for ONC requirements. You'll also find the link to the template, which is hosted on our real world testing webpage at the bottom of this slide. All right, so again, real world testing plans must be made publicly available on Chapel December 15th. Real world testing results must be made publicly available on Chapel by March 15th. Make sure you understand ACB deadlines. This is just to say that your ACB is going to be responsible for accepting those plans and making them available. Now let's get into the real world testing plan elements, because we have outlined the elements that must go in your plan at 170.405B. Here they are: testing methodologies that you're going to use, standards updates, associated certification criteria, description of the measurements and metrics being used to measure that functionality and conformance, the care settings in which you market your certified health IT, justifications for your real-world testing approaches, your expected outcomes, and the key real-world testing milestones. So we're going to dig into these a bit. Definitely want to be sure that you guys understand, what each of these means and so on and so forth. So just want to make note and reiterate that the developer must determine the best processes and procedures for working with their customers to observe their health IT modules in a production environment. The developer already works with their customers. And so, you're just best suited to come up with these approaches and understanding your customers, where they're implementing your certified health IT, what their workflows and needs are and everything. And so you're just best positioned to do so. So this presentation is really just to get you thinking about what needs to go in for each and every one of these elements, okay? So when determining your testing methodologies, okay, you want to consider some factors, all right? We put some factors out there for you to consider when you're thinking about your methodologies that you're going to use for real-world testing, and that's going to be the size of the organizations that production systems support, the types of organizations and settings, the number of patient records and users that are on it, system components and integrations, volume and types of data exchange, certification criteria measured individually or concurrently, and health IT modules addressed individually or concurrently. All right, so these are just these are factors that are not a limited subset. You can certainly think about other factors that are not included here. We just wanted to put some out there so that you can understand what we're thinking about, what you should be thinking about when determining your methodologies. Okay. Something else that we want you to make sure that you understand is that you can choose how many plans you might have. Developers have the flexibility to structure their real-world testing plans however they see most fit. So you may have one plan, you may have multiple plans. That's truly up to you and depends upon, what you think will best suit your unique circumstance. As far as testing environments, the deal is that the purpose of real-world testing is to demonstrate the functionality in a real-world scenario. So when you're thinking about the testing environments and everything, you want to make sure that you're really shooting to do it in a production environment. You're shooting to use real patient data. Your approach should really start off with using the real world scenario for when your product is being used in the field, okay? So when you're thinking about your testing environment, just make sure that you're starting off with, understanding the underlying intent of real world testing and, making sure you approach this in a way that you're keeping these real world scenarios at the forefront of your approaches. All right, so we get an FAQ quite a bit about modified approaches throughout your real world testing activities, okay? So the FAQ is I submitted my plan, but now that testing has begun, our approach doesn't fit the needs to successfully test the real world setting. Am I allowed to stray from what I submitted to my ONC ACB, and do I have to submit a modified plan? So the answer is you may modify your approaches. Okay, we totally understand that as you're conducting real world testing, you may get into it and say, hey, we envision this working out, but it's not really giving us the results that we're looking for. And you can do so. You can modify your approaches. So although you're not prohibited from doing so, you're not required to submit a new plan. Okay, ONC is not going to post updated plans on Chapel. The plan that goes up on Chapel as of the December 15th deadline is the plan that's going to remain. And you're going to just have these adjustments made, and you're going to address them in your real world testing reporting. Okay, so you want to work with your ACB. If you're modifying your approaches, you may want to let your ACB know, or you may want to just give them a heads up that when you're submitting your results reports from real world testing, that you have some modified approaches in there. And when making adjustments to your approach, your results should reflect the type of changes that were made, the reasons for these changes, and how the intended outcomes were more efficiently met as a result of these changes. So this is a fully transparent process where you can literally just completely be open about how you're addressing real world testing and how you're going about approaching demonstrating conformity when your product is being used in a production environment. So just check with your ACB on any other additional considerations for handling these types of adjustments. They may have some other ways in which you guys can work together and make sure that this is a very, very clear adjustment to your approach and that it's accurately reflected in your results reports. All right, now, we're going to get into standards updates and how they work into the plan, okay? So the ONC Cures Act final rule requires that developers update their certified health IT to certain newer standards and implementation specifications that were previously adopted and incorporated by reference. These updates are applicable to certain criteria. We'll go over that in a second. But these are accounted for in real world testing. So when you make these updates, you don't have to go back to your ACB for them to evaluate these changes. You actually include these updates in your real world testing plan so that you can go out and test it in a real world production environment in a real world scenario. So what we want to do to ensure that you have updated all of the required, you have updated your certified health IT to all of the required standards updates is review the 2015 edition Cures Act, final rule for the relevant criteria updates and associated timelines, because there are deadlines associated with these updates. You want to work with your ONC ACB to ensure that all updates to selected criteria cover the scope of your certification. There's a requirement to notify customers of updates to respective products. And once these updates are completed, you're going to, your ONC ACB is going to reflect, they're going to be reflected on Chapel. And then developers should account for updates in the real world testing plan as mentioned and incorporate these updates into your measures. All right, so here are the updates. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but just know that this is a slide to reference for all of the updates that are required for standards and their associated deadlines. All right, there's another way in which you can perform updates to your certified health IT. It's via the standards version advancement process, where this is a voluntary process that allows developers to update their certified health IT modules to more advanced versions of standards and implementation specifications that have been incorporated by reference. These are updates that or newer versions that must be approved by ONC. Okay, so you can't just decide you want to update. These are going to be put out every year. There's tons of information on the actual process. We're really talking about how this works into the real world testing plan today. But these updates must be, these newer versions must be approved in order for these updates to happen. So when you're doing your updates via this flexibility, where ONC puts out newer versions of standards that they've approved, you go out and you take advantage of that flexibility and you update your certified health IT. You're going to account for these updates in real world testing as well. So we have a link to more information on this FVAP process at the bottom here, but we just want to talk about it and how it relates to real world testing. So we get an FAQ quite often where folks want to know if they want to update to newer approved versions of a standard via the SVAP process, can they do it through real world testing? Okay, so it's a little bit tricky and we want to make sure we provide clarifications. So the real world testing is not the process or the method for making these updates, okay? The standards version advancement process is a process within itself where there are specific things that you have to do to perform these updates. And then you report these updates, you include these updates in your real world testing plan. And then you go out and make sure that once you've updated, you know, via the SVAP process, that they still work, that it works the way it's supposed to, the functionality is there. Okay, so in order to do so, you want to provide advance notice to all affected customers and to your ONC authorized certification body. Okay, you're going to express your intent to update to the newer version. You're going to express for this update how it will affect interoperability for your particular health IT module. And you're going to say whether you intend to continue to support the existing certified health IT module version of the standard that you previously had. So you want to just let your customers and your ACB know what's going on, what you had, you know, how you're approaching these updates, and if you're going to still support the older versions as well. You have to successfully demonstrate conformance with the approved more recent version via the real world testing. That's how this connects. That's how this relates to real world testing. is that you go out and you literally determine, you know, that in a real world environment that with these updates, your functionality is still there and you remain conformant to the certification requirements. So you're going to work with your ONC ACB to make sure that these updates are included in your chapel listing. And you continue to hear me say, work with your ACB, work with your ACB. Just know that your ACB is here, has the information that you need and knows the requirements for which you need to report to them, as well as your customers for, you know, making these updates. So it's very important that you just stay in collaboration with them as you're working through real world testing. And then you maintain the updated certified health IT module, make sure that it maintains full conformance of the certification program requirements, okay? Once you've taken all these steps, again, included in your real world testing plan, make sure it works. All right, so we have also put out there what should be, and this is also included in the real world testing template, what should be submitted for each standard update, okay, in your plan, all right? There's a lot of information that your ACB needs to know, and you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about completeness because you just want to make sure you're submitting all the information that is required, because each and every one of the certification criteria that is within the scope of your certification has to be addressed, all right, for each element of the plan. So the way that we created the template and the way that we're advising you today on this webinar is to make sure that you know what information will satisfy a complete plan and will help to satisfy the elements that must be included within your plan, okay? So you want to include the standard and the version, obviously, that you've updated to, right? You want to include the certification criteria in which the product has been updated. If you're reporting for multiple products, you want to identify the certification criteria that were affected by the update for each of the associated products, okay? So how does this update affect each of the products if you have if you're reporting on multiple products? The chapel ID for each health IT module, the method that you use for the standards update, because I just talked about two different things. I talked about required standards updates, which was the snapshot of all of the different standards that are required by certain deadlines that we've put out in the CARES Act final rule. And then I've talked about an optional pathway for you to update standards via the standards version advancement process. So the ACB should probably know what kind of update this is. So the method used for the standards update, the date the notification was sent to the ACB, because you should have notified your ACB of these updates. The date notification was sent to customers. That is for the standards version advancement process only, as it is a requirement for SVAP. And then the measure used to demonstrate conformance with the updated standard, okay? Remember, the measure has to address all of the certification criteria, the full scope of everything. So you want to identify this and provide that traceability to the measure that's being used for conformance. And then which certification criteria were updated to USCDI and or to which version of USCDI was the certification criteria updated, okay? So this is all within the optional template. This is what ONC is advising you include so that the ACB can fully understand you know, what you're submitting, what these updates apply to, and everything like that. So again, the template is optional, but this is just what ONC is putting out there to help guide how you're going to put this information out there, how you're going to lay it out, and to make sure that you have effectively addressed this element. All right. So when you're identifying measures for real world testing, developers have flexibility in selecting measures. Again, developers have full flexibility in how they're going to approach real world testing. And so you should keep in mind some things. Again, this webinar is just to help guide your thinking and how to make sure, you know, you don't have a lot of confusion around how to meet these requirements. But just keep in mind that every real world testing plan must have at least one measure, a minimum of one measure, okay? Now, this measure has to address all of the applicable certification criteria, but it has to have at least one, all right? Each applicable certification criterion must be addressed in a measure, as I just mentioned, or metric. And developers with multiple certified health IT modules and or products certified to multiple certification criteria will likely incorporate more than one measure in order to adequately address all of these criteria. So, you know, you may have more than one measure. It just depends upon the approach you take and how you're going to measure and what measure you're going to use. I'm sorry. And, you know, if it really covers all of the certification criteria that are applicable for your scope of certification, it must be real world test, and for which you must conduct real world testing. Each type of care setting in which your certified health IT module is marketed must be addressed. Now, notice I said the type of care setting. So we don't require that you real world test every single care setting, but you have to cover every type of care setting in which you market your certified health IT. All right. Measurements and metrics can be combined in many ways to yield results. So again, you know, one measure could potentially address multiple criteria in care settings. And then the measures and metrics should demonstrate ongoing interoperability and functionality relative to the certification criteria, okay? So these are just considerations as you're identifying your measures. These are no new requirements, guys. This is all outlined in the Cures Act final rule, just pulling it out for you to have it all in one place. We also have put out and identified certain measures that might be favorable and some that might not be favorable, okay? This is going to go to the completeness of your plan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So when we're thinking about the type of data that we wanted to use, again, as I mentioned earlier and stressed earlier, we want to use real patient data. You know, this is real world testing, right? So you want to make your approach, you know, to target real life, you know, activities and how these real patient data, you know, real world environments, you know, this is the whole point of real world testing. So real patient data, the rate of success or failure, okay? Notice we say rate of success or failure. Real world testing is conducted over the course of an entire year. So you may have, you know, different measures that you include that shows, you know, your rate of success, okay? Number of errors compared to successes over time. So just notice where this is not a one-time deal. This is not a, you know, we put in our plan, we're going to go out and do one activity or take one action and we'll understand how our product functions over the course of an entire year. So those are favorable factors to consider for types of data. Unfavorable factors would be like a yes-no measure, because that really doesn't tell us anything about how your certified health IT module functions in the real world. You know, it doesn't tell us anything about that. Pass, fail, you know, doesn't tell us about how over time your certified health IT module meets the certification criteria to which it's certified, the applicable real world testing criteria. And then the use of test tool as a proxy for measurement. You know, test tools are used for the controlled testing environment for ONC ACL testing. That's not what this is intended for. We want you to really go out, consider real world scenarios, your customers' workflows, real use cases for when your products are being used out in the field, okay? And then the collection method, you know, you could consider some favorable factors, data derived from networks that developers participate in, you know, data derived from the use of test tools, okay? So you're taking that data, you're extracting that data from there, you know, for demonstration. But, you know, so we want to make sure that you understand that you are able to do so, but you want is just a collection of data over time, okay? Surveillance results indicating conformity or nonconformity, not a favorable factor to be considered in your collection method, all right? Surveillance, again, is an ACB activity, and that is a different thing. You know, the real world testing is not to redo the ACB job. Okay, we already have the ACB covering that. Single instance for demonstrating interoperability or data exchange. Again, a single instance is not going to show how over time throughout the course of your calendar year of real world testing demonstrates conformity to the applicable real world testing criteria. So just know that the ACBs have been informed to look for these things, and they'll consider these few things. And we're not telling you, you know, exactly what you need to put in there, but we're just letting you know that if you think about the underlying point of real world testing, that there are certain measures that are just not going to hit the mark for demonstrating over time. So your planning needs to be to describe in detail how you're going, what measures you're going to use. And these along the right column are not going to be favorable measures, and you may get some pushback from the ACB to add some details, some additional detail for your approach and how you're going to demonstrate conformity to the requirements of your certification, okay? Now, well, let's get into the second part of identifying measures. We have outlined and identified some special scenarios that you might consider for your unique circumstance as a health IT developer and for your certified health IT. So we know that there are resellers of certified products. We know that there's relied upon software or third-party software, cloud-based products, and products with non-deployed capabilities. So we're going to run through those. All right. So let's talk about relied upon software really quickly. So within our program, ONC allows for health IT developers to use third-party software that they did not develop to include within their testing and certification process to demonstrate capabilities, okay? These are also reported on Chapel, and ONC, you know, is basically saying, hey, if you have a certification that's been issued based upon use of third-party relied upon software, you have to make sure that that is included in your real-world testing. Because remember, this is a full scope of your certification. And if you use third-party relied upon software, that's a part of your certification. That's within the scope of your certification, okay? So if the certification that's been issued by the ONC ACD includes third-party relied upon software, if it's on the Chapel with, included within your certification, you have to account for it in real-world testing, okay? So just going to work with the third party the same way you did for certification. You know, you're going to work with the third party to make sure that you have it covered in real world testing the same way that you did for the testing and certification product. You already have, process. You already have these relationships in place. And so you should be able to be really considering how you're going to work with that third party to make sure that they're covered within your real world testing activities. For cloud-based products, again, if you offer the same, if you have a cloud-based product that offers the same capabilities across multiple types of care settings, you still have to test within each care setting type, okay? You can't just pick one type of care setting because the capabilities are out there via your cloud-based product. You have to definitely make sure that you still cover every type of care setting in which your cloud-based product is marketed for use. All right, now resellers of products, okay. Here's the thing with resellers, basically developers are responsible for communicating any real world testing requirements for their remarketed products, all right. You have these relationships, business relationships where you're allowing another party to resell through your partnerships or other distributors. So you wanna make sure you communicate to them this real world testing requirement. They're on Chapel, so they're subject to real world testing, okay? ONC does not specify whether a reseller or the original developer is required to actually fulfill the real world testing. So you wanna make sure you're working with them, the partners or distributors of your remarketed product to make sure that it's covered for real world testing, because again, they are listed on Chapel. They go on Chapel, as a, certified health IT module. So it still has to undergo still has to be subject to the requirements and still has to, do real world testing for those listings. ONC permits the inheritance of plans and results by developers authorized resellers. Okay, so that's something that you also want to be sure to communicate with your partners. And then if the reseller markets in a different setting than the original developer, so say you're the health IT developer, but your reseller markets in a different setting type, then it's up to you and your, distributor or the partner that you have that is reselling your product to determine how you're going to cover that care setting type. Okay, so you have to negotiate and make, make those arrangements with your resellers. And then check with your ONC ACB for any additional requirements around reseller reporting, okay? All right. Now, for designing real-world testing plan and identifying measures for the special scenario of products with non-deployed capabilities. All right, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because we want to make sure that you're absolutely clear on what this means for you, okay? So we understand that capabilities exist that can be deployed on a modular basis, all right? If it's included and represented on Chapel in the scope of the certification, it must be included in real-world testing. So because it's not deployed doesn't mean it's exempt, all right? There's nothing that we put out there in regulation that exempts capabilities that have not yet been deployed or a customer isn't using for whatever reason that exempts you from real-world testing, all right? So you want to leverage your flexibility here to come up with different approaches that you can use to work with your customers to make sure that you are able to account for real-world testing, okay? Fully optimize the value of real-world testing for your current customers and your potential customers. Work with customers on how they might help you out and how you might make arrangements with them to come up with a way to demonstrate that this capability still works when in a real world, even if it's not deployed. You want to, again, we always want you to think about real world scenarios, real patient data, real the environments in which the certified health IT is deployed or is used. But you also have the choice, if all that fails when working with your customers, to consider synthetic patient data in addition to or in lieu of real patient data. Simulated test scenarios might be considered if you just can't get into a real world environment where you can get these things tested. This is an opportunity for you to work with your customers to identify scenarios, use cases, workflows that this capability would be used in the real world. But for in these day-to-day activities, but the bottom line here is it can't be left out. These capabilities cannot be left out. They're not exempt from real-world testing. You have full flexibility to be creative about how you're going to demonstrate real-world testing functionality in the real world. And if all of this fails, just know that every attempt that you made, everything you tried needs to be reported in your results, okay? So you should be able to in detail report within your real-world testing results report, okay? I tried this, I tried that, I tried, simulated environments, I tried synthetic data, and this was the results of it, okay? So this all still has to be accounted for, whether you're able to successfully figure out a way to assess it in a real-world environment or not. You still have to account for these capabilities that have not yet been deployed in your real-world testing. All right, so I'm going to move through wrapping up the presentation with covering the rest of the elements within the plan. All right, so for a description of your measure, you just want to, so this here, just for completeness and making sure that, you really cover each of these elements in your plan. The measure, you want to make sure that the measure that you choose shows that you've conducted real-world testing over time, right? That over time you've conducted real-world testing, and that it shows how you've demonstrated conformity throughout the entire year. And then the justification of your approach, why did you choose it? Why it's important to realize that, the justification for your measure and approach is really fully explained. Why did you choose to approach real world testing in the way that you did? So you want to provide the rationale for that, how, these approaches are going to, really help you to demonstrate successful real world testing. So that should be included in your plan. And then the associated certification criteria, again, the template helps a lot with how to make sure that each element is accounted for each certification criterion that's included within the scope and subject to real world testing. Care settings. We talked a little bit about this. Just keep in mind that each type of care setting has to be included, and on top of each type of care setting, you have to include a justification for why you chose those care setting types. So make sure you know that as a part of the element to cover each type of care settings, that you also submit a justification with the types of care setting you've chosen for why you chose those care settings. There's some considerations for care settings, that care setting types that we have here. So you might want to consider settings or healthcare provider types not excluded from real-world testing requirements based on eligibility or ineligibility for federal healthcare or programs or initiatives. A real-world testing plan is not required for each individual product or each individual care setting location. Again, just the types of care settings in which you market your certified health IT. Health IT developers may bundle products by care setting, criteria, etc., and design one plan to address each, or they may submit any combination of multiple plans that collectively address their products and the care settings and care setting types in which they're marketed. And then health IT developers should construct real-world testing scenarios or use cases that test more than one care setting applicable to the health IT module if they exist, okay? Now, we always get the FAQ of what care setting types should be included. We don't define them. ONC does not define, or limit the care setting types in which you market your certified health IT. Again, the health IT developer is best positioned to determine the types of care settings in which their products are marketed. But we do have some examples here, okay, to help you out with this. And to consider. So health ID developers might consider categories that are included but not limited to those that are used in the promoting interoperability programs, long-term and post-acute care, pediatrics, behavioral health, small, rural, underserved. These are different types of care settings that you might consider. Again, these are just examples to get you thinking about what your unique circumstance might entail. All right, now expected outcomes. This is really straightforward, guys. What do you expect to happen with your approaches to real-world testing plans, okay? The bottom line is that you have in mind an outcome that you see demonstrating the conformity of your to certification criteria, okay, to the certification requirements, the full scope of certification requirements for the criteria subject to real world testing within the scope of your certification. So what outcomes are you expecting from these measures and these methods and, within certain care setting types? What are you expecting to see out of it to demonstrate that conformity? You might consider that expected outcomes should provide transparency into what the current and potential customers would know about your certified health IT and its effectiveness in demonstrating interoperability when tested in the real world. Also reflect what should not be a result of a given action. That's totally okay as well. Should be measurable, okay, and indicate the level at which your certified health IT modules are providing optimal user experience for your customers and other stakeholders. All right, so key milestones, guys. Listen, this is basically a timeline for the steps that you're going to take in executing your plan, all right, over time. So just make sure that, you have considered how you're going to execute, on what timeline you're going to execute certain actions. Your plan has to describe those things in detail. These milestones may include, the development of candidate list of providers to assist with real-world testing, development of software, which could be used to gather data for analysis, finalization of the real-world testing plan and submission to ONC ACB per their instruction, collection of information as laid out by the plan for the period, validation of expected outcomes, completion of test suites, cycle of testing begin and end, completion of test phases, the end of real-world testing period or final collection of all data analysis, and the analysis and report creation. So again, guys, you just want to make sure that you have laid out in your plan what steps you're taking on what timeline to, implement what you put in your plan and to be sure that you meet these milestones, to be sure that you're able to implement these actions and meet these milestones so that you can stay on track for, executing your plan in a way that's going to demonstrate successful real-world testing. Now, just really quickly, nonconformities that arise during real-world testing. Listen, we totally understand that you might get into a real-world environment and something might come up where something's happening and you just, it just wasn't expected, or you discover something that you didn't realize would happen in a real-world environment. That's totally fine. You just want to report it to your ONC ACB. The ONC ACB has processes in place to help developers who self-report nonconformities. This isn't anything new. Developers self-report nonconformities outside of real-world testing, so ACBs have processes in place for that. So you just want to make sure you know how it works, familiarize yourself with your ONC ACB processes for self-reporting nonconformity, communicate nonconformity findings to your ACB within 30 days as a requirement for real-world testing. You'll see the section copy below for where that requirement is within the Cures Act final rule. And then just work with your ACB to develop a plan to correct it. This is the whole point of real-world testing. You're demonstrating, how effectively your product, your certified health IT module meets certification requirements in the field. This is an opportunity, for you to highlight, certain things about your product, what you want your customers to know, what sets you apart, how what about your product, do you want to highlight to let the world know that it meets all of these requirements, even after the controlled testing environment, after the ONC ACB issues a certification against all of the criteria within the scope of your certification. Post-certification, once it's deployed, once it's rolled out and people are actually using it, what do you want to highlight about how you can assure people that your product, your certified health IT, still meets the requirements of ONC's health IT certification program? So guys, we have some resources out there that we put out. We recently published our real world testing resource guide, from which a lot of this information was pulled. So there's going to be a lot more detail in this resource guide on the different items that include clarifications on timeline requirements, details on the plan elements needed to meet requirements, all of which I went over today, but there's going to be more, in-depth details on each of these on each of these elements, guidance on special considerations for unique products, customer and or settings. And then, guys, something that we would not have been able to get through today, but you definitely want to make sure you take a look because it could really, really help you in designing your real-world testing approach, is we have also included sample scenarios to illustrate the creation of a real-world testing plan to support testing for health IT modules that must complete real-world testing for a single criterion and health IT modules that must complete real-world testing for multiple criteria. So this is a great section, a great appendix of the real-world testing guide that you want to make sure you take a look at. This is a great resource, guys. Just make sure that you visit our real-world testing webpage and take a look at it. And then, as you know, real-world testing, we have other resources, a fact sheet that was released earlier this year in February. This is the link to our real-world testing webpage where you can find all these resources. So the fact sheet is a great snapshot, high level of what it means for health IT developers. We have the plan template that I went over on today's webinar. We have the resource guide I just went over. We have real-world testing certification companion guide, and we have previous webinar recordings and slides. So guys, listen, we have tons of resources out there. Take a look at them, continue to give us feedback, continue to, submit your questions, work with your ACB. I can't stress that enough, is to work with your ONC ACB on your real-world testing requirements. Here is ONC's contact information, where you can contact us with any additional questions. Sorry, we had a bunch to cover in today's webinar, so we do not have time to take questions for wrapping up the webinar today, but we hope that you got a lot out of it. We hope that you're able to go ahead and continue to develop your real-world testing plans, continue to work with your ONC ACB to ensure that you have submitted a complete real-world testing plan for it to be made publicly available on Chapel no later than December 15th. this year and every year to come. So guys, continue to give us feedback. We will continue to roll out additional resources, do additional webinars, and to really, really continue to engage and work with the developer community to make sure that you have all the information you need to go out and conduct successful real-world testing. So thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you for joining today's real-world testing webinar. We have in the chat, we will take note of all of your questions and everything and hopefully incorporate it into future resources and future webinars. So thank you so much. Everyone is free to disconnect. Thanks for joining.